Welcome to the Know Your Legacy podcast. I'm your host, Vipul Basania, and today's guest is Jeanette Schnieder. Jeanette is a speaker, author, and women's activist. She's written a book called Law, which helps you unlock your past so that you can have a bigger, better, and brighter future. And she's also the host of a podcast called Gold with Jeanette Schnieder. Thank you so much for being here, Jeanette.
I'm delighted. Thank you for having me.
So we were just talking about the weather
Yes.
off there, because it's drastically different right now. So for those who are listening, like in London, it's like 0 degrees, which is 30 in Fahrenheit. And what is it where you are? 60, you said?
It's 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I live in Las Vegas, so it's just like moderate weather right now.
It's
beautiful.
I think anyone here would kill for that one.
I know, and there's something called the polar vortex going on the east coast of the United States right now, where people are like negative 21 degrees, and I just put on the air conditioning because it's warm here. So completely different.
So you were saying as well, I think you just came back from Africa. Was that for work, or what was the reason you went out there?
I actually went to Africa because I left my corporate career recently. And when I decided to leave to do what I'm doing now, which is to write and to speak and all of these things, I was like, I need to have this almost this celebration, this trip that's like the portal between lives. Because I was in finance for 20 years. And so I wanted to see something like that I would never get to see otherwise. And so I went on safari on the Serengeti. I went to Ngorongoro Crater and spent a few days there, and then relaxed in Zanzibar. So it was a 2-week vacation, just immersing myself in a completely different culture and way of life. And it was amazing. I feel changed from it. Absolutely. I don't think you can have those types of experiences and not feel changed in some way.
I love that, because one of the guests that I had on a few months back, Eric Edmeades, he works with a lot of clients to help them grow their businesses and have basically more of a freedom lifestyle. And he one of his philosophies actually he was saying is to have mini vacations. So he believes in gap years, which is very similar to what you said, but it's like after every milestone. So go to college, gap year before you go to the working world. All right, if you've done like a year in a career, take a gap year, and then before every major shift, do another gap year and do something crazy just to break up the monotony, rather than waiting until like 50 or 60 and trying to do like 10 years worth there.
Right. I don't know that I believe in retirement anymore. I have an executive coach that I work with who's really helped me in the transition from the corporate career into what I'm doing now. And his whole thing is like, you do everything in 90-day increments, which is like completely changed my mindset. So, really creating 90 days of goals and knocking them out. And then at the end of 90 days, you celebrate in some way. For like 10 days, you don't go as hard and you do something really amazing, whether that's a small trip or buy yourself something. And I was like, I'm going to do the big trip. Like after a 20-year career, I'm going to do the big trip. But I do believe you have to live your life while you still have opportunities and health. And I don't believe, I used to be very much the student of the grind, like you grind and you hustle. And I don't like those words anymore, because I really believe like once you get to more of like an aligned place and you know what you're doing and you know what your gifts are, you have to celebrate when you have the milestones. It gives you something, brighter to look forward to. It's
almost like making it a part of your life rather than like a separate chapter or a separate decade, like that we're I guess taught or conditioned to want or to strive towards. And it's like intertwine it into your life now in whatever small way that you can, so that you're enjoying yourself as you're going along, rather than waiting for this big chapter to arrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also helps those people who have some type of creative aspect to their jobs or their roles or whatever they're doing. When you have the opportunity to get out of your kind of day-to-day and see the world and realize how small and self-obsessed we are many times, it funnels such creativity and such momentum. Like I've come back and I've got another speech that I've written based on spending time with villagers and the Maasai warriors and seeing the circle of life happening on the Serengeti. And I'm like, I wouldn't have that content or that kind of perspective where I could take kind of a step back had I not gone to live a little life, in between all of the things on my calendar.
Most definitely, because there was a few people that were asking me about how do you come up with ideas for content for social media? Right. And like the way that I've naturally done it is based off experience. Like
Yes.
content comes from experience. So the more experience you have, the more things you have to talk about, the more thoughts you have, the more interactions you have, the more emotions you feel that you can then express and share. So, I mean, before we get into like your whole journey of writing and then the
Sure.
book, etc., can you share some of the most fascinating things that you saw or took away from or found in your journey, like in Africa?
Oh, absolutely. I got goosebumps just when you asked the question, because like there are two, I'm still kind of unpacking it because it was big. It was a big trip. The first one was I'm moving from a corporate mindset to an entrepreneur mindset, more of a creative, right? So I'm used to the, like, your day is supposed to look a certain way. And it was kind of interesting because when we were on the Serengeti, we had guides and they took care of us in every way, shape, and form. Like, we were actually camping on the Serengeti. So like when they put us in our tents at night, we were not allowed to leave because there was animals walking through camp. And I was so struck by just what we were seeing, the animals killing, eating, birthing, this whole entire death, birth, destruction kind of happening before me, but also the service, the hearts of service that the men that were part of the camp had. And because I got to see the other side, how they were going home to severe poverty and situations where there was no electricity and running water. And they were treating us as if we were their most honored guests. And it made me really realize, like, we have to encapsulate that heart of service. And it kind of refocused the way I was looking at my day and saying, rather than being nervous about what content I'm creating or how my book is selling, or, how am I getting this workshop from red to black and making sure that I'm making enough money, how are the people who are receiving the information feeling when they walk away from me? How are they being impacted? Like, am I using the same type of heart of service? And that was really impactful. And the other thing that I really took away, we did something called a reef walk on the Indian Ocean, where off the coast of Zanzibar, the reef is actually quite a ways from the beach line. And at first I was like, oh, it'll be fine. We'll just have these reef shoes. And they gave us these walking sticks. And I grew up in Florida, so I was around water all the time. So I was like, it's no big deal. Well, the coral is really, really sharp, and there were eels everywhere and sea urchin. And it was actually kind of a little treacherous in a few places. And when we got to the very end, the guy said, congratulations, you're very brave. Not many people actually go all the way through. And on the way back, we were really leaning on our walking sticks because you had to, in some places, kind of get over coral or get around coral. So not to be cut. I scared a sea snake and it like sprayed purple ink everywhere. Everyone thought that I'd cut myself. And he said something that was really funny because people were like not holding each other's hands and helping each other along. They were relying so heavily on their sticks. And he said, don't rely on your stick. It is there only to give you balance. Rely on yourself. You are stronger than the things that are there to serve you. And it just like was one of these moments where like you're in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I've got eels all around my feet. And I was like, that's really profound. That like all of the things that we lean on and we use to keep us strong, whether it's prayer, whether it's meditation, whether it's alcohol, whether it's sex or drugs or self-help books, whatever it is that we're using to feed ourselves with, those are the things that we're using to balance and to kind of traverse. And he's like, don't rely too heavily because they will break and you will fall. You have to stand strong knowing that your body is stronger than your stick. And I just kind of was like, oh, wow, that's so profound. We don't give ourselves enough credit for the strength we have. We're always looking outside of ourselves for the things to lift us up. So those two things, I'm still unpacking the rest of it, but like those two moments, I was like blown away. I was completely blown away.
That's a lot just there by itself. If you just come away with those two things, I think it sounds like it shaped your perspective quite a lot in terms of how you now approach your life being in the Western world, you know?
Oh, absolutely. I came back and everything seemed silly. It was kind of funny. Like I got home and I was like, everything is so silly. Everything that we do is so silly. And, you get back into life and back into the grind and things like that. But I think it has kind of calmed me down a little bit because I think I was used to this old way of being where it's like, have you made your numbers? Like, have you proven yourself to everyone? All the people that you left in your career, they think you're crazy. Prove them wrong, prove them wrong. And instead I'm like, oh, I've got this. Like I have to just rely on myself and the fact that I know I can create content and the fact that I feel inspired and allow myself, to kind of walk more into that art of the heart of the servant, but also to kind of, it's eased things a little bit. Like I don't feel as stressed when I wake up since I've been back. I'm like, okay, what things do I need to do today? How do I need to best serve my purpose and create, knowing that the rest will follow?
Most definitely. I think so many people that are listening and otherwise as well are, you get stuck in your mind a lot. And this conversation just goes on, like these stories that we've been telling ourselves, and we get stuck in them, and we forget that, what everything that's going on around us, so much so that life passes you by the days, hours, minutes, years sometimes, and you don't realize that all you've been doing is living in your head, when actually being present is where the enjoyment of the journey is. Like I was thinking today actually about like a few years ago, and even now sometimes I struggle to think, who am I really? And it's this whole story of like putting myself in a box, because that's how I've been conditioned, going through school and college, etc. Like you're conditioned to have like a name, like an executive or a lawyer, and for so long I was like, well, what am I? Like, what do I do? Where do I fit in? And what I realized is actually you don't need to know who you are. You find out who you are by living. It's a journey. The same way you figure out who your life partner is, the same way you figure out who your children are. It only happens when it's time to happen. Other than that, you just enjoy the journey as it happens. And it's the same with us. Who we are is all an evolving thing. And so I think in your journey, that's been a part of you writing your book, because you weren't in a place to write that. Let's go back maybe 5-6 years ago, even sooner than that. And it's been the journey of figuring out who you are. So I know you've been writing for a long time. So if you take us back to like, I think 13, around that age, right? You were writing. So what was life like then? What was the environment like? What were you thinking?
It's funny. So I started writing, I think, because my dad didn't know how to deal with all of the emotions of a 13-year-old girl. And when I was 13, one of my close friends' dads passed away from leukemia, and I couldn't process it. I couldn't understand death. It didn't make sense to me. And, my dad would try to talk to me, and I just had all of these feelings. And so he actually went out and bought me a journal. And he was like, everything that you're feeling, that you're unpacking, that I can't figure out how to help you with, I need you to put it in here. And he like handed me a journal and was like, get going. So I started writing when I was 13. And what's funny is like, I started writing just my feelings and my thoughts. And then all of a sudden I started writing short stories and poetry and all of these things. And I remember in high school, when I was in 11th grade, we would walk in and I had this amazing teacher who would just write a few words on the board. And she would say, hey, for the first 3 minutes of class, use those words to create a stanza, a poem, a short story, whatever. And then she would come around, and I loved it. It just set me free, but I hadn't told anyone that I was writing yet. To me, it was a very personal thing. It was very private because it was my own. I was very vulnerable when I was on a piece of paper. And I just have this like love affair with words. They just mean the world to me. And she came around and she actually sat down next to me. We had kind of like an auditorium style seating, and she read what I wrote and she started crying. And then she said, I need to speak to you after class. And I was like, what did I do? And after class, she pulled me into her office and she says, you write? And I was like, I do. And she's like, I want to see what you write because you haven't told anyone. And she was so frustrated with me because I ended up going into finance, and she was like, you're a writer. And my mom and dad were like, you will make no money as a writer. So she always wanted me to like go into these competitions. And I'm like, no, it's really private. It's really private. And it wasn't until 2009 that I started blogging publicly and created this entire community of friends and writers that finally were like, Jeanette, you have a great voice. You need to actually harness it and use it. What's interesting is that, so I've been writing forever. I write stories, I write plays, I write whatever. I had a blog for a while, which was like my own take on Sex and the City, kind of like very, witty, kind of here's the day in the life of me, but it wasn't of importance. There always was like me making fun of myself, self-deprecating, and how at the end I learned something. So it was kind of like an Aesop's fable, but very like pop culture. When my daughter was born, that's when I realized that I had to use my gift of language and words to actually do something important. And that's when the book came about, and my most recent blog efforts, laurenlittlethings.com. So I started just blogging about women and girls issues and self-esteem and raising strong girls and things that I was seeing in the world, that I was a mother to a daughter. And the book actually was accidental. I had asked a bunch of really successful women, I'm like, hey, you're really successful. Some of them were pseudo celebrities. I'm like, people would love to hear your true story. Like, I know that you were raised without a dad, or that you had an eating disorder, or that you were, gang raped your first year in the Naval Academy. Nobody knows that. And if people could have you take off your shine and see how successful you are because you overcame difficulties in your life, I think that would be a really great way to virally mentor other women and girls. So we started posting them, and it took off. And then the women that were writing the letters came to me and said, I don't think you realize what you have. This is a beautiful thing for us to offer other people parts of our stories, but I have just uncovered things I didn't know about myself. And it was therapy I didn't realize that I needed. And all of a sudden we started having these conversations, and in the process of them writing these letters and really doing some excavation and visualization in order originally just to help other people, they were realizing that they were uncovering old messages and old stories they believed about themselves that were societal, generational, cultural, through advertising. And it was just astounding how much of what we believe about ourselves is completely untrue. And so that's kind of how Lore, the book, came about. Some people saw what I was doing online in the letters, and MGM Resorts here in Las Vegas reached out and asked me to make a workshop out of it. And so I went in front of a room full of like 250 women, and I was scared out of my mind because I was like, it's a corporate conference and I'm going to ask them to have feelings. Like, I don't think this is a good idea. And I got up in front of them and I basically asked their permission. I'm like, I'm going to walk you through this journey, and you may not like me at times because I'm going to make you do really hard work. After I was done, it took me over an hour to get out of the room because women were coming up just shocked by things that they realized during the course of the workshop. So it's kind of interesting, like the trajectory of writing. Writing started with me just being a 13-year-old dealing with a lot of feelings and grief. And it ended up through the course of many years becoming a very pointed, purposeful thing, which I'm so grateful for.
Do you remember what you wrote in that letter or that the piece of writing that you did at 13?
I do. I vaguely remember it. And it was about a child. The child is father of land, running, playing, experience life, always in love, never in strife. And then I can't remember the last stanza, but it was basically as he was running through the field, and by the end of the field, he was an older man looking back and having seen the death of the field and how his vision changed from being so young and being so excited and so full of life and everything being good, and then being an old man looking back at grief and death and sorrow and war, and how he was now kind of shifting his focus back to the future. And I can't remember the end of it. I'll have to find it one day. I know that I've got it in one of my notebooks, but that's the one. Her name was Mrs. Wood, and she was like, you have to write. Like, this is your thing.
Have you been writing ever since then?
Yeah, I have. I hid everything. I hid all of my writings for a very long time. I actually had a drawer full of notebooks. I mean, it was piled completely full of notebooks. And my ex-husband, my daughter's father, when we moved in together, and he opened and he's like, what is all of this? We've been together for a year, and he didn't know that I wrote. And he started looking through them, and he was like, you have a gift. And he actually went out and got it was 2005. He went out and bought me a laptop computer and was like, you have to start blogging or writing or something. Like, there's something here. So I wrote my first book, which no one will ever read. So from 2005 to like 2006, 2007, I wrote more like a coming of age memoir, and it was terrible. But they say you have to burn through a book to learn how to write. And then after that is when I started blogging publicly.
Yeah, I think it's almost like practice of getting your feelings out on paper without, like, how do you do it without thinking about, oh, will I look good? And like the balance of like, oh, I'm trying to sound clever, but then
Mhm.
I want to get my message out authentically as well for those who are trying to write or express themselves.
I think it's practice makes perfect, because at first, a lot of times when you're writing, you have a tendency to be almost like self, you're not as self-aware. You're not as aware of your audience and how they're receiving your information. It's almost kind of like you're cutting your veins and bleeding onto the page, right? There's a lot of emotion, but there's not a lot of structure. And so I think it takes some time and some finesse. If I go back and I read the things that I wrote in 2009 through 11, they were very snarky and full of way too many words, because I felt like I needed to be dangerous on the page and I needed to get people's attention. And what I realized, I said so much more with less words, but intentional words. So I think it's just over time, you're going to completely change as a writer. But I also recommend that people, if they're writing for public, they don't use that as their journaling. Journaling to me is something that should be stream of consciousness and not structured. And that's where I feel like you really start unlocking the unconscious parts of yourself. And that to me is like a beautiful process that is, it's personal and separate and apart from sometimes the message that you want to get out there in the world, because they'll get muddled if you're not aware of how your reader is perceiving your message.
What advice would you give, if any, to people who are trying to write at the moment? Like, just because of the fact that you've gone through that journey yourself, is there anything you'd do different? Anything you'd wish you did from the start?
I wish I would have allowed other people I trusted that were writers to give me advice without being so. When you're a writer, it's very personal. So the first couple of legit writers who read my stuff and would have feedback, I was very defensive. And I think the one piece of advice I would give to someone is, if you want to be a true writer, if you want to actually have your works published, find someone who is not related to you, who is not like, they need to be a writer, and have them read your stuff, to give you pointers, not because they need to line edit it, but someone can look at it who's been writing for a long time and give you advice and be like, hey, I bury my lead. I know that now because I had a great editor who said, every time you write us a paragraph, I learn what I need to know in like your fifth sentence. Bring it up top. So now I know that I have this weakness. I think that's the one piece of advice I would give, is find someone who's doing it and who's objective, who can look over it and tell you what you're working on and what you need to work on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think a part of us is probably scared that we don't want to hurt our ego or whatever it is. But I think that's the quickest way to learn anything, right? It's just to go to someone who already knows what they're doing and let them critique it and trust their expertise and their journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's, as long as you just have to have an open mind, because a lot of times when we write, we think it's absolutely gorgeous because it comes from our soul, and it could be absolutely beautiful, but it probably could be even more beautiful if there was a little bit of structure around it. So you have to kind of be open-minded with that.
Well, so the name of the book's Lore, that's Lore. What does that mean for people who don't know what it means? What is it? And like, why did you choose that name?
Lore is for the folklore of your life. So you're kind of excavating your lore, your stories that are within you. And I struggled with the name for quite some time. It ended up coming back to my grandmother. I had these really beautiful conversations with some people in my life right before they passed away. And with my grandmother, it was more, there's some things she needed me to know before she died. And one of them was, don't worry about the big things. They take care of themselves. Worry about the little things and love each other every day. She told me not to worry about, certain things that were bothering me, or religion that we were raised in, or our self-deprecating humor. And I started really thinking about that. Like, my goal is to help people unlock their messaging and excavate their messaging so they can understand the difference between what they've been told to believe and what they actually believe, before they pass down negative self-talk and old messages to the next generation. And so I was thinking about that generational passing down of knowledge. My grandmother sharing knowledge with me that was very clean by the time she was passing. You know, through the course of our lives, we have a tendency to be like, you should do this. You need to live the, you know, this kind of, in the States, we have the American dream of home ownership. We have, you're supposed to have a job until you die, and you're supposed to have a pension, and you're supposed to go to church, and you're supposed to, and every person that I've known that has passed, and we've had a conversation before they died, they're like, none of that stuff matters. I know I told you that, and I taught you that, and I raised your parents to believe that, but it doesn't actually matter. Those are just constructs that have been put in place to keep us safe. Love people in your life. Be an honorable person. Make sure that you take care of the people around you. And so those big conversations to me were like just dropping serious knowledge. It was like this lore was being passed down. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to excavate my lore so that by the time my daughter is raising her children, we have more pure messaging that's being passed down.
That's an amazing gift that she gave you before she left, because it's like really telling you like the truth about her life and about life generally, like what she's figured out, and allowing you to have that early without having to live through all the same years just to find out the same thing. So I'm going to ask you, what would you, if anything, pass down to your daughter Olivia, like knowledge wise?
I think for me, I want her to know how powerful she is. I think I want her to realize that she has a voice, and she has the ability to make life whatever she wants it to be. I struggle watching her start to move into friendships and social constructs to fit in, and I'm like, you can do anything you want. You know, you want to be president, you want to be a Power Ranger, you want to be a farmer, I don't care. You have the power to do anything you want. And I think that's one of the messages I want all girls to know, is what kind of power that they wield, if they can kind of get out of the mental constructs and the things that we tell them about life and the way it should be lived.
Is the book only for women?
No, I mean, so I write for women, and I've had this question a lot, but what's been really cool is having guys read it and share their thoughts, because I think of my daughter at all times as I'm writing, and you know, it's mostly women that wrote the letters. There's actually one man who wrote a letter that's in the book, but I changed his gender and his name to make him a woman. He asked me to at the time. He wasn't ready to share his story. And he was working with me. It was really interesting. He was my brand manager, and he had been working with me from the very beginning. So like, he was fully aware of all the stuff I'm throwing out at him about, you know, women's issues and gender and media and all this stuff. And so he's like, you know, I probably should write one of these letters myself to see like what it's all about. And he did, and he realized that he had completely shut himself off from emotional relationships because his father had tried to commit suicide when he was a child multiple times. And when he was 5, 6, 7, he had locked himself in the car at the hospital and wouldn't come out. And his first sentence in his love letter to his younger self was, "It's okay to come out of the car." And he's like, and he started crying, and he's like, I didn't realize that all of these years, that moment was a cardinal moment where I learned to shut everything out because it hurt, but I also shut out love. And I could say the words, but I could never feel the words. And cut to a year later, after he wrote the letter, we were talking, and he's like, I can now walk into a room and I can understand people's feelings and start to empathize and sympathize. And it's been beautiful to see the men who have been like, this has been important to me. I've had a couple of them get choked up and either call me or email me and say, I realized something that my mom said when I was young has stayed with me and messed with me. Or, you know, this was really hard and I didn't think it was going to be. So it's not just for women. It's every child that needs to be reparented, every younger child that we have within us that believes something that's not true. It's something that we need to excavate.
What's the biggest takeaway you want people to learn from, or hope that they, you know, go to bed with after they've read the book?
Oh gosh, that's a complicated one, because the first thing that people tell me is like, oh my God, this is really hard. And my biggest thing is just keep pushing at it, right? Go through it, just do it, because the other side is so blissful. I think more than anything, I want them to know that there's freedom outside of these noises in our head and stories that we've been told and beliefs about ourselves. And a lot of times our feelings of unworthiness, if we achieve and we get a great job, but we don't feel like we're worthy of it, or in a relationship and we're watching the same cycles go over and over again, if we're watching ourselves parent our children the same way that our parents did and we're disappointed in ourselves, there's freedom in actually being aware of those things and starting to restructure them and change those paradigms. And I think people feel locked a lot of times in their old cycles. And there's that victim blame, like, well, this happened to me, I can't help it. And I think that's more than anything. I just want them to know that there's freedom on the other side of knowing yourself.
Yeah, most definitely. I think once you uncover the masks or the layers that, you know, we've been fed or we've put on intentionally ourselves over the years, you start to realize who you really are. And there's I can send you this afterwards actually, but there's a really good story about the Buddha and how, I think it was in Thailand or India somewhere, they had a statue of a Buddha, and basically it was worshipped by, you know, monks, and they worshipped it daily. But then over time, I think when there was an invasion, they covered it up with like cement and stone and stuff, so it hardened and it hid the statue so that they wouldn't know the statue was there, because they held it so highly in their eyes, so they wanted to hide it and make sure that they didn't come after it. And the statue was actually made out of gold, so for that reason they covered it all up when the invasion happened. Anyway, over time people forgot about it, and then weeds started growing, etc. And then I think there was a boy who dropped a rock on it, like this is years and years later, and it cracked. And he saw a bit of the gold, and after he saw that, he started cracking everything away to realize that there's gold underneath it. And the point of the story in that documentary I watched was, we all have that inside us. We're all gold, and over time we're all covered with cement and weeds and rocks and whatever it might be. And when we chip away and we find just a little bit of it, it becomes a process we become addicted to, because we want to find out who we really are. And the more you chip away, the more you find out, actually, this is who I am inside. But it's all the mental conditioning and the beliefs and the social constructs that are made to hide that. And then we forget if we don't take the time to chip away at that and to figure out who we really are.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful story. And I think it's so true. And one thing that I've shared with people is like, the moment that you get that first understanding of yourself, like that first sentence shows up, like for me, when I wrote my love letter, it was, you'll spend most of your life believing you are unlovable. If the moment you write that, you can't look away from it anymore, right? And so you have to continue to dig and to understand and to see how messages and the weeds and the cement, what's actually there. And that's one of you do become addicted to that self-discovery and that self-knowledge, because there's just this like sweetness on the other side of it, where all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I've walked into work situations believing that I was unworthy. I've walked into romantic relationships believing that I couldn't be loved. What could it be like if I actually believed the truth about myself? What could my relationships look like? What could my career look like if I actually harnessed that gold? I think it's a beautiful story and please send it to me.
I will, no, most definitely. Yeah. I will do, definitely. So I'll link it for those who are interested as well, listening. But
beautiful.
So the whole process of writing a letter to your younger self, I think it's a way of uncovering what would you wish could have happened if you had the time to go, if you had a time machine to go back and re-raise yourself almost. So like, how does that, for those who don't know, how does the process work? Like, so if someone comes to you and says, I want to do this for myself, what's the first thing they do, and where's the mental space they need to be? Yeah.
So I think, when you say mental space, I think you have to be in a place where you're kind of like, okay, I'm doing this, right? It's going to hurt. It's a lot of people they walk away from it. And I'm like, you can walk away from it for a minute, for a day, for a couple of days, but don't leave it. So you have to kind of have a commitment to yourself that you're going to do this work. The next thing that I recommend is to really start to visualize that younger version of yourself. And I walk people through a visualization where, I want you to see the age of that younger version of yourself. What do they look like? What are the expressions on the face? What's the posture? What clothing are they wearing? Where are they at? Like, what's the setting? What's the lighting like? And then at one point, once you get that person in your head and you can see them, what do they want to know from you? And that's when I feel like people are like, oh, you know, there's all of a sudden this, like, there's this knowingness that comes out. And for me, it was this little girl who was very poor, who was wearing hand-me-downs, and who just wanted so badly for someone to hold her and tell her that they loved her. And it was just like this overwhelming kind of message, this vision of this younger self. And what was really also very beautiful is that everyone that has gone through the process has turned very nurturing and loving towards their younger self. When we're in our present day, we have a tendency to be like, why did you do that? You know better. When you're looking at your younger self, you typically are like, oh, wow, you believe this about yourself, but you didn't have the tools, right? You didn't know better. I've got you. Let me support you. So there's suddenly this kind of shift in the way you're actually loving on that younger version of yourself. And it's almost like a reparenting. Most of the people that I've talked to who've gone through deep work have said, I don't regret the things that have happened. I don't wish that they were different necessarily, because once they've gone through deep work, they realize the lessons in it, right? The beauty in some of the things. So rather than regret, I think it's more forgiveness of self and others. And when I've gone through my workshops and we've done these visualizations, a lot of the people, when I say, is the person to be forgiven, you know, who is that person in your life? What did you need as a child? Who is that person that you need to forgive? And there's been several women that had been the victims of sexual abuse and molestation. And it was not only their abuser, but as a surprise to a couple of them, it was themselves, because for some reason they thought that they brought it upon themselves. So one woman wrote to her 4-year-old self, this wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. And then she was like, I can't believe I thought this was my fault my entire life. So there's almost this unlocking, unhinging, and realization. And it is work. It's definitely work. It's not a one and done type of thing. But I think more than anything, the mind space is a commitment to self and to higher self, like a commitment to the highest version of yourself. And a lot of people I share, you know, the beginning of the book is about the past and the letters and forgiveness, but it gets sweeter, right? So the next section is about the present and choosing the positive relationships and moving from passive aggressive victim blame to an active choice orientation, and then what the future can look like when you tap into your higher self. So it's not an entire book of like sad memories. There is a process where like you move into like a much brighter spot. But I think it's one of those things that you have to get all of those things out first before you can manifest a bigger, brighter future.
Do you have a favorite part of your book, like that you enjoyed writing the most?
That I enjoyed writing? I think my favorite part, this is actually kind of funny. So the brand manager I mentioned, he got my draft, and he called me, he's like, hey, so it's really strong, except your parts on relationships. It's so weak. Well, because I believed I was unlovable my entire life, and I had just realized it through the course of the book, like I was like, I can't write about relationships because I've been in terrible relationships. And he's like, you got to get better. So I actually had to spend some time researching, reading books on marriage, psychology of relationships, things like that, to actually create a roadmap of what I believed. And so the sections I write on choice and relationships were probably the most fun, because they actually required me to do a lot of digging. And I met someone at the exact same time that I was writing the chapter. And I was worried that he was going to see all these books on marriage in my house and be like, what the hell have I gotten myself into? So I was like, so here's the deal. Like, I'm writing this book and I have to do research. And he's like, wait a minute, you have a roadmap of what you want in a relationship? And I'm like, yeah, I just wrote it. Here's the chapter. Like, here you go. So like, that was probably the most fun, because it required me to do a lot of work on, I pulled out this whole I'm unlovable, but then I had to actively be like, okay, now how do I fix it? How do I make sure that this relationship I enter is a beautiful, purposeful, mindful relationship? So that was probably my favorite part.
From all the books that you read and the research that you've done, what's the one thing that you learned about relationships through that process?
That conflict is a good thing, and conflict and intimacy are not to be feared. And communication is huge. And I think it's one of the things that I was afraid of in the past. If there was conflict. I assumed that I was going to be left. The idea of opening myself up too much was very scary. And out of everything that I've learned, it's when I'm starting to feel the most like, oh gosh, like that's when I need to actually be like, hey, I'm feeling this way. I need to tell you about it. And it's been a game changer.
That's amazing, because I think for so many people, communication is like where it breaks down. Like that's the thing where we're like, oh, you know, I think also it's out of judgment or fear of judgment that we think maybe I shouldn't tell them, or maybe I should, like, you know, brush this one under the carpet. And then you don't realize that happens over time, like months and years go by. And then you get annoyed because it's like, why don't you know this about me? But you say that in your head to yourself, you know, and like you get into this, I guess you get into this rut where you expect them to know certain things about you, but you haven't said it. And so it's really small things. And I've seen it happen with different people in my life. And all of it can be removed if you just communicate and you're on the same wavelength. And I think it takes a conscious, as you just described, like a conscious roadmap of what you want and how your partner can support you in that journey, if I'm saying it in the right way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the one thing that I've learned. And thankfully, I now have a partner who's very open to it, because he's like, I've never been in a relationship that's been so, like, we had our first fight while we were in Africa. It was the very first one. And the thing that I loved about it was that when we actually talked about it and we're like, okay, let's get through this, I realized I was triggered. He realized that there was a miscommunication, and that in the end, we had both reverted to old ways of dealing with our partners. He was dealing with me the way he had dealt with his ex-wife. I was dealing with him the way I dealt with my ex-husband. And I was like, okay, we just both reverted to an old school way of talking to each other, and we need to like not do that again. But I agree with what you said about like brushing things under the rug. One of the things I said to him is, I'm like, if we don't talk about the things that are bothering us, I'm going to get resentful at some point in time. And I think that's the other thing that's really important in relationships, is to actually give it a word. And rather than being like, oh, he annoys me, or oh, I can't believe she did that again, be like, I'm starting to feel resentful because, or this made me jealous because. If you can give it a word, you can start to unpack it and understand, rather than it just being like one of those annoying little things that goes under the rug that eventually becomes this much larger thing. And I've approached him a couple times where I'm like, hey, we haven't covered this situation. Something kind of bothered me. And I know if I don't cover it with you and it keeps happening, we keep relating in the same way, I'm going to get mad at you. And he's like, okay, let's talk about it. And that's like nothing on him. I'm like, that's me. I'm going to respond to you the way I've been conditioned to all of my life. And I'm trying to communicate and relate in a different way. So I have to be able to talk about this. And he actually told me, he's like, I've been able to show up in a relationship in a way I never have before, which I think we've given each other permission to kind of raise our hand and say, this is what I want. This is what I need from you.
Yeah, I think when you have the permission to just be yourself, or you feel like you have the permission to be yourself, that's when you can both show up in the most powerful space. So it makes a lot of sense. Just to go back to the letters a little bit, sure. From all the letters that you've seen women write, and including yourself, is there like a running theme of what people or women would say, or actually men and women would say to their younger selves?
There are a couple of themes. They're not always exactly the same, but what I'm seeing is a lot of a woman's self-esteem has to do with her mother's view of her own body and relationship to food. So women who have written about their own issues with their bodies typically have had something to do with their mom or grandmother's relationship with their own bodies. If they had issues with intimacy or issues with relationships with men, there's a lot of, what I saw too is that a lot of girls, their parents didn't talk to them about healthy relationships, or that they thought they didn't understand gender dynamics in an adult relationship. And so they thought that their bodies were something that they gave to a man. And so there was not conversations happening in homes with those letters that had to do with body and sexuality. They were overhearing the way the parents were talking in their gender discussions, but no one was actually communicating with them and giving them advice. So I saw that. That was one portion. A lot on worth, lovability, feeling forgotten. And what I found with those is a lot of times there was, if you kind of got down to it, There was either trauma that had happened generationally, that people were kind of holding back and not sharing or comparing children to other people in their lives. So sadly, there was a couple of guys who shared, it was mom comparing son to the boyfriend. Like, why can't you be like him? You need to be like this version of a man. And the boy being like, but I like Broadway, and I like, I'm a different person than he is. So they all wrapped up like as a different situation that created the belief that there was unworthiness or that they weren't lovable. But it always like turned into the same like core words. And it was all around those things. There was, of course, the folks that had experienced deep trauma. I interviewed a woman who lost her leg in the Boston Marathon bombing. And that was trauma is a completely different, severe trauma is a completely different experience. It rewires the mind and the way they view the world. And those were some of the hardest interviews I've ever done. I did 2 of them on camera, and hopefully one day they'll be up for the world to see. And they were really beautiful. One of them, she was the one that was molested when she was 4. And then she was gang raped in the Naval Academy her first year. And the way she would enter abusive relationships because of these traumas was just devastating. And she continued to find people who treated her very, very poorly because she continued to be treated very poorly by men. So it's just, I think everyone has such a very specific experience in life. So you can't put people in psychological buckets. But I did see some themes mostly about value and worth.
It's interesting you say that. Like, we were talking before we were on air about Mastin, or briefly anyway, like that I interviewed Mastin, and one of the interesting things he pointed out was a quote, I can't remember it word for word, but I think it was by Jung, and he said that the number one thing that stress kids out today, or at any point, is the unlived life of the parents. Yes. And I wanted to bring it up because I know you've talked about cycles and breaking cycles. So how do you recognize a broken cycle, and how do you stop from passing on when you have your own family, or for those who currently have families?
Yeah, absolutely. I've broken the cycle in my family. So all of the women on my mother's side of the family had been victims of violence, raped, and continued the cycle of violence through domestic abuse and child abuse. And my mother is an alcoholic addict. And it was a choice I had to make, especially when I became the mother to a daughter. And I, a couple times, would catch myself using my mom's words when I was talking to my daughter. I'd already knew, like, I got hit way too many times. And I already knew that I would never hit my child, and I would never spank her. And that I felt very strongly I wanted to use my words. And I have been a strange relationship with my mom, so I haven't seen her in a very long time. My daughter asks about it. She's like, why haven't we seen grandma? And I explained she has grown-up problems. But it's a choice. I think that you have to make a choice. It's not one of those things where, like, oh, can you tell that you broke the cycle? Oh, look what you have to make an active choice to say, this will not continue, and have enough self-awareness. And my daughter asked me one day, she goes, Mommy, how are you such a good mommy? And I said, because every time you need something from me, I say, what would I have wanted from my daughter at this age? And then I do that. Because I didn't have that. My mother was, I know this sounds very strange, but thankfully, because she was drunk most of the time, even though she had us, I didn't suffer the same kind of abuse that she did. And when I wrote the book, I sent her a copy of it. And I just said, I want you to know this is out there. I need your permission to tell my story. I have to tell my story for me to be able to talk about being the mother to a daughter and how I feel about raising strong girls. I have to be able to give some context. So I want you to know nothing in it is untrue. And that I was very conscientious not to tell all the stories, just enough that people understood. And she read it, and she actually she says, you're a great mom, and you've done a great job. And it was really strange because it was freeing in a way, but she also shared with me some of the abuses she had suffered before me. So for those people, especially if you're an adult child of an alcoholic, or you've experienced sexual violence or any type of child abuse, I truly believe that you have to make a conscious decision to really evaluate your own beliefs about worth and pay attention. Like I call it a pause. Before I communicate with my daughter, I take a pause and I think, okay, how is this building her as a human being? And I see her as a mother, as a wife, as a friend, as a leader. And I see her in the future and say, if I tell her this now, what kind of person does this build? So I truly believe to break cycles, you have to consciously reparent yourself, figure out your own inner dialogue, but then figure out how you're going to communicate with this little person, because it's not going to be what comes naturally to you.
Yeah, it's important. And I think everything that you've just said, the overarching theme from what you discussed before as well, is just the importance of words. Like the words that you use create the constructs, the beliefs, the wisdom that you pass on, and then that becomes the beliefs and the constructs that the next generation grow up with, or at least for the better part of their life until they become conscious enough to change it. So
right.
As you were talking as well, actually, I was just thinking, if there was only one other person that could read your book before all copies were gone from this planet, who would you want that one person to be?
Oh God. That's such a hard question. I think part of me is like, I think of the girls that I just saw in the villages in Africa, right? And I would love to be able to help an entire, the way I looked at it when I wrote the book, and like if one woman reads this book, or one man reads this book, and it changes their own dialogue and they help the next generation and the people they influence, that's a ripple effect right there. Like, so that would be an amazing thing. Part of me wants to say some woman in some global community that really needs to be uplifted. And part of me wants to be like Oprah, because I need someone with a platform to share the truth, right? So it's kind of like, should it be someone that can like change their global culture, or should it be like their community culture, or should it be someone who actually has a platform who can share that? So those are the two things that came to mind immediately.
Yeah. I think, the powerful thing is, and I can't remember who was having this conversation with, and I was listening to it actually from a different podcast, and I think it was Gary Vaynerchuk and a music executive called Scooter, and he was talking about how when you're networking with influencers in this day and age, and Instagram and all that sort of stuff, he was saying, don't worry about trying to reach people who are like Oprah's level or similar, even though that's what everyone wants to do. They want those people in their network. Fair enough. It makes sense. But you need to give more focus to those who are your peers, because the ones that are coming up now, because in the next generation, they will be the Oprahs and the executives, and the ones that are changing the world for what it is, or recreating what the next version of the world is going to look like. And so it's important to forge relationships there. So don't forget, just because they don't have a following or their name isn't known, that doesn't matter. Just look at the type of character that person is, because the character essentially forges the destiny of the person, because who you are is what your life will be as a reflection of who you are. And so if you're selectively choosing who's in your network now, those will be the people that go on to shape the world. So I think, those two thoughts were powerful, but it would be more powerful to hand it to someone who could surpass Oprah, like levels ahead of where we can even imagine is possible right now. You know?
No, that's really great advice. And it's so funny because I gave a speech to Girl Scouts recently for their STEAM conference, and they're not even sure who Oprah is. And I was like, what? Because one of them asked me a question, and I was telling him, like, you are so powerful, like higher ed and finance, we're studying your generation because your buying habits and you're philanthropic and you've only ever had technology, and we're studying you and you're so powerful. And this little girl goes, if I'm so powerful, why do I still have to do homework? And I said, well, like Oprah says, you have to do what you don't want to do until you can do what you want to do, or you have to do what you have to do until you can do what you want to do. And she was like, who's Oprah? And I was like, oh, like, never mind. So you're absolutely right. I have to find that person that's just I need someone to fall in love with it. That's it. You got to find someone that's going to fall in love with it. It's going to resonate with their heart, right?
Yeah, most definitely. So before we get into the final few questions, what's in terms of like next steps of where you see yourself going, or all the things that you have planned or lined up for, like what's going on?
So I have this desire to create a women in like a mom-daughter conference for young women and bringing them together for a weekend. So I'm working on that right now and bringing together some people who are helpful when it comes to establishing strong friendships and conversations around self-esteem, social media, things like that. So I'm working on that. My thing is, I feel like I'm really supposed to empower the next generation. And I have been very involved with Girl Scouts and I've done a lot of work with them. And it's kind of funny because one of the things that I've learned is I left corporate America so that I can advocate for the next generation because they are the future. And then I was like, the future is because of this generation. These girls got it on their own. They just need a couple of people to help, mentor and support them. So I think everything that I'm working on is for that end right now. I'm loving podcasting. It's super fun. I'm getting to meet some really amazing people. So I'm just going to continue with that. And I speak quite a bit. So I've spoke at Mount St. Mary's, had some requests from a couple of different universities to come speak to their students. So anytime I can interact with young women, it just makes my day.
Awesome. No, that sounds amazing. So just to get into the last few bits then, I think the first one we kind of covered, but just to be more specific with the question, is there anything
Sure.
different you would tell the 18-year-old Jeanette with everything that you've gone through?
The 18-year-old Jeanette, I would tell her to trust herself more. The advice that I gave her in my book was, you are so powerful, to my much younger version, the 5-year-old version of me. But sometimes I think we forget ourselves, when we forget how resilient we can be. And I think that's one thing I would say is stop looking outside of yourself for validation. Trust yourself more.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's applicable to so many people listening right now as well. So if there was one statement that you could write that would go into a time capsule for generations from now to read, what would the one statement be?
These are like high pressure questions. I feel like so much anxiety to get this right. I think it would be, to ask people to find humanity in others. I think that's the one thing that sometimes we lack, as we look at other people as being adversaries and we look at them as being different. I think the biggest piece of advice that I would want to leave the next generations to come is just find the humanity in every person. Once you realize how alike you are, the conversations shift.
Oh, I love that. So the last question, and it's with everything that you've done and everything that you're going to do in the future, you've lived a fully adventurous life and you've done everything. And on your last day, what's the legacy you hope to leave behind?
I actually have visions many times of that last day and with the people around me, looking at me and just telling them I've lived a good life and just love each other. And I don't want anyone, the one thing I've known for a fact for my entire life is I feel like I have such a relationship with words ever since I was very young. I know that when I write and when I speak, I can make people laugh and I can make people cry. If you can make people laugh or cry when you write or you speak, that's a big thing. So if I leave my words behind, that's my legacy. If I leave my words and they shift anyone's focus or perception or the way they live their life, I'm done. I'm good. And I think for me, it would just be to look at my daughter and be like, I'll see you next time. I can't wait to see what we're going to do next. I don't want her to be fearful as I move on, because I feel like I'll see her again.
Yeah, see her in the next adventure. So no,
exactly.
So if people want to follow your journey, find out what you've been doing and where you're going to be going next, where can people do that?
My website is JeanetteSchnieder.com. I'm always on Instagram at ms.JeanetteSchnieder. And you can find everything else through there. The book is on Amazon. The podcast Gold is on Apple and Spotify. And I'm always out there in the nether regions of the internet.
Awesome. Well, no, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been amazing. And we definitely need to do part 2, towards the end of the year, to see how your journey's been going.
Oh, I would love that. I would love this. That's super fun. So thank you so much for having me.